It's a film which kind of interrogates the nature of the film experience and what it means to be a movie.
Hello everybody, my name is Ron and welcome to Why This Film, the podcast where we explore the artistry, cultural impact, and legacy of movies in the Criterion Collection. Each episode I sit down with experts and cinephiles to ask, why was this film chosen for the collection and why does it still matter today? Today we're talking about La Jetée, a groundbreaking 1962 French short film that redefined what cinema could be. Composed almost entirely of still photographs, it's a meditation on memory, time, and human longing, and it remains one of the most influential science fiction films ever made. Directed by Chris Marker, La Jetée tells the story of a post-apocalyptic survivor who becomes the subject of time travel experiments, only to discover that the images from his childhood memory were leading him toward his own fate. Celebrated for its innovative form, philosophical depth, and lasting influence on cinema, most notably inspiring Terry Gilliam's 12 Monkeys, La Jetée doesn't appear in the Criterion Collection as a standalone release, but it's paired with Marker's Sans Soleil in Spine number 387. Joining me today is Dr. Dennis Weiss. Dennis is a retired professor of philosophy at York College of Pennsylvania, where he taught for over 30 years. His scholarly work spans philosophical anthropology, consciousness, the post-human, and the ethics of technology. He co-authored Designing the Domestic Post-Human, exploring how technology shapes human identity and lived experience. Beyond the university, Dennis is deeply committed to public philosophy. He curates Philosophy, Drinks, and Film at Zotropolis Cinema Stillhouse in Lancaster, Pennsylvania, a monthly series now in its 6th year that brings together cinema, critical thinking, and community conversation. When I asked Dennis, how do you choose films for the series, he explained that there are certain genres of film that consistently raise philosophical questions, the kinds of questions that come up again and again in serious writing about cinema. It's that lens that made him the perfect guest to join me in exploring Chris Marker's La Jetée. And with that, here's my conversation with Dr. Dennis Weiss. Was there something that drew you to the theme of time travel? Was that something that you had previously taught, or you came to it because it was something that was interesting to you?
I've taught it multiple times. So science fiction is probably the only genre of literature, if we can call it literature. Science fiction is probably the only genre of literature that I read. I'm very untutored in that regard, but I love science fiction and I love time travel stories and I love time travel films. But then I also, beyond teaching philosophy and film, I also regularly taught a course on science fiction. And so both of those courses allowed me to feature either the literature or the films of time travel. And time and thinking about time philosophically is such a core philosophical idea that it's just historically hugely important and continues to be relevant. So the science fiction angle, the film angle, the fact that we live in time and really have to be thinking about time all of the time just makes it really interesting and relevant to me.
Is there something about La Jetée that made that choice to include it in your 4 films for that series? Is there something about it that made that an important choice to include it?
Well, there were a couple of things. So I've been wanting to do more in-depth presentations as part of Zotropolis's series than what I typically do in the regular PDF screenings. So as you know, typically I'll go 10, 15 minutes at most. And it's worthwhile and it's good, I think, and it doesn't impose too much on audience members, especially audience members that are anticipating that they're going to get a lecture at the beginning of these films, because despite having been doing this now for more than 5 years, I still get new people who come for the first time and don't know or aren't aware that there's going to be an introduction and at least the opportunity to have a discussion afterwards. So I've wanted to do some more in-depth presentations. And La Jetée permitted that because it's a 28-minute film. And I couldn't really ask people to pay $15 to come and watch a 28-minute film. And so it occurred to me what I could do is I could package it with a longer presentation on the philosophy of time travel. So what I did that evening, the
And I missed
evening
it.
that you
And that's
missed.
the one I missed. Oh, it would have set me up. I would have been set up for success the rest of the next 3
Exactly.
months.
That was close to a 45-minute presentation. So partly that it was a recognition that it gave me an opportunity to do something a little more in depth. And that was really a test run for the film noir series. Because the film noir series, I'm also asking people to make more of a commitment to. And that means I need to make more of a commitment to. So the presentations will be a little bit longer. They'll be a little bit more in depth. They'll have a slightly more scholarly component to them than is typically the case. When you show up to watch a movie at PDF, I haven't asked you to read anything in advance. And I'm not going to ask people to read anything in advance, but I'm going to make it possible for them to read some selectively curated essays in advance that touch on specific themes related to the film. And so this gave me an opportunity to see if people were willing to sit through a 45-minute presentation rather than a film itself. So that was one just kind of practical reason. The other reason is, well, it's such a definitive time travel film. It's been extremely influential. It's still influential today. It's still cited today in terms of its influence, both cinematically, but also philosophically. Over the course of the series, we watched 4 films, 2 of which I think were probably more rigorously philosophical, and 2 which were not. And they were all entertaining, but La Jetée and the film that it most directly influenced, 12 Monkeys, I think gets time travel right from a philosophical perspective. Whereas something like Back to the Future is very entertaining and it's a lot of fun and there's a lot to talk about, but its conception of time, philosophers will find very suspect. And so La Jetée has been extremely influential, both, I think, cinematically and philosophically. And so it was a good place to start.
It was really hard to break down a movie based in stills into segments, but I managed to do it. So we open with The Memory at Orly. I couldn't make the screening, so I started to watch it myself, and I didn't finish it my first watch because I thought, oh, what is I don't want to watch a slideshow presentation. I'll just go see 12 Monkeys. It's fine. Then when I really went back to it, I said, no, I have to do my homework. And I'm so happy that I went back and watched it because we're talking about time, but this film also gets into the idea of memory. Can you shed a little light on your thoughts on how Chris Marker's decision to use still photographs and how that choice ties into that theme of memory?
Sure. Well, I think it's really fascinating that you say, I started watching it, but I couldn't actually get through it the first time because it is kind of a challenging piece in that regard. And it challenges our very conception of what a film is. Because typically we think film means, well, moving pictures. And this is a film that has no movement to it outside of one very brief clip 2/3 through the film. So it's a film that's completely static in the way that photographs are static. He lingers on each of those photographs for an average of about 4 seconds per image. Your typical film runs at about, 24 frames per second. So he's really doing something that's kind of challenging us to think about the very nature of film. So in thinking about the question that your podcast is raising, why this film? I think one of the fascinating questions is, how does this film challenge the very nature of what it means to be a film, to be a movie? But I think it's also interesting because it raises questions about as you pointed out, the very nature of memory. And I think in a lot of respects, that's something that younger people in your generation and earlier generations don't necessarily have in the same way that Chris Marker probably had and that I have. Because I remember growing up as a kid going to visit my grandmother's or my grandparents' house and looking at still photographs. You open up a photo album and there's all these black and white photos. And as soon as you open up that album and start looking at them, your grandmother or your grandfather might sit down and start telling you stories about those photos. Photos are a way of kind of traveling in time via memory and the memories that the photos evoke. So there's a sense in which memory is kind of a time travel. Maybe it's the initial kind of time travel that we do as we think about the past or we project ourselves into the future. And we do a lot of that when we look at still photographs. And of course, in the early 60s, that's all that they would be looking at in their photo albums. They wouldn't be looking at Instagram. They wouldn't be looking at TikTok. They'd be looking probably at black and white still photos, and they would be remembering the things that those photos recorded and probably raising questions about what they remember about those moments that are recorded in those photographs, whether their memories were accurate or not. Because I think another thing that this film is really interested in is the nature of whether memory is veridical and how it's shaped and reshaped by our subsequent experiences. This is a middle-aged man who's remembering back to a few seconds that he experienced as a young boy. And what is the nature of that memory that he's having as a middle-aged man of what he experienced as a young boy? So there's, I think, a real sense in which it's interested in the nature of memory and the nature of whether memories are accurate and how they pull us into the past, and how looking at a photo album, for instance, which is a different kind of experience than looking at an Instagram or a TikTok, how looking at a photo album kind of does tug us into the past and present us with questions about what happened and how we understand what happened.
And I wonder too, because the memory that he's going back to, he saw something traumatic. He's at a pier with his parents, and he sees a man shot and killed. And later we come to find out that he's actually witnessing his own death. But I wonder if the reason why that memory may be so clear for him is because it was a traumatic event in his childhood.
Well, I think there are two things to think about. I think you're right. It was a traumatic event. And he also, though, remembers the image of the woman. And it's the woman who ultimately, it's the memory of the woman who ultimately pulls him back to the past. He is a successful time traveler because the memory of the woman is so indelible in his mind. It's not so much the traumatic event, though perhaps the image of the woman, the memory of the woman is tied to the traumatic event, but it's the memory of the woman that is so indelible that it allows him to go into the past. In the film itself, we learn that the experimenters, the people who are experimenting on him, have experimented on other people and they failed. It hasn't worked. Their intuition is you have to have a vivid memory that will allow you to be pulled back into the past. And the memory that pulls him back into the past is as much the memory of the woman as it is the traumatic event. So it's the two things kind of tied together that is so indelible to him. But surely you're right that there's an element of trauma there, because we have to assume shortly afterwards is the apocalypse.
The voiceover or the narration says soon afterwards Paris is blown up. And
Exactly.
then there's some talk of radioactivity, which alludes that this was, he mentions World War III very early, was one of the first
Yes.
lines. And then Paris is blown up. There's mention of radioactivity. And the time that this was released was 1962. So, in part of the questions that I have are what was the impact of something like this when it was released at the time? We're in the midst of the Cold War,
Hmm.
and there's this fear of nuclear war throughout that time period. Is there something to be said about these themes that they're presenting? I mean, it's pretty grim. You're looking at the Eiffel Tower, and then it slowly fades, and then it's just everything is decimated.
Yes. And I think it's not only kind of that prescience of the coming Cold War. The film is released in 62, if I remember correctly. 1963 is the Cuban Missile Crisis. They're in the midst of the Cold War. But it's also the case that Chris Marker photographed a number of sites throughout Europe post World War II. he actually contributed still images to the famous film, what is it, Night and Fog, I think it is, that he worked with, where he was actually roaming World War II in the aftermath of World War II, because 62 is less than 20 years after World War II. And France had been particularly hard hit, and Marker incorporates into La Jetée some of the photographs that he took of France post World War II. So there again, you have a connection to memory, a very vivid connection to memory, where Marker is himself memorializing and remembering the devastation of World War II, but he's also somewhat prescient in recognizing the coming problems with the Cold War and incorporating both of those things into this film. So I think another way in which the film becomes hugely important and influential in terms of its relationship to both what was in the past and what will come in the future.
Speaking of the future, now we see post-war underground, and the word victors is used twice in a very short amount of time. And it made me think about 12 Monkeys, because we don't know who these experimenters are. We just know that they're in some sort of position of power. Same with La Jetée. But if everyone is underground, is anyone really victorious? Like, how it just raises a lot of other questions in terms of the plot of who are
Absolutely.
these people in charge, and how can you consider yourself victorious if we're all stuck underground because we have decimated the world that we had.
Absolutely. And I think there are a number of elements that kind of feed into that. One of the noteworthy aspects of the film, beyond its form in terms of still images and its philosophy in terms of its addressing the nature of time, is the kind of soundscape of the film. Sound becomes hugely important throughout the film, in the voiceover, in the music, but also in the various sounds that you hear over the course of those 28 minutes. And one of the most intriguing ones are these voices that you can't quite make out what they're saying, but they're speaking in German. That seems pretty clear.
That stands out.
Yes, absolutely. And again, if you put this in the context of less than 20 years after the end of World War II and the discovery of what was going on in the German concentration camps, that kind of experimentation upon prisoners must have been very evocative to the viewers of this film in the early 60s. And it still stands out as a sense of, well, as you put it, who are the victors here? Who's being oppressed? Who's being experimented on? Why are they being experimented on? Where does the power kind of lie in the context of the people who are clearly oppressing these individuals?
And this is why I'm glad that I watched it and put it back on, because for something, we're approaching the time that you and I have been talking. We're approaching the length of the film itself.
Exactly.
And we're pretty much he has not even begun to be experimented upon.
Yeah.
We hear the voiceover then say the outcome. So they're talking about these time travel experiments. We hear our first whispers of German at this point. We're told the outcome of these experiments was disappointment, death, or madness. Now we come
Hmm.
to find out that he's telling us how this is going to end. It's going to end one of these three ways, and it does. Is that our director? This is where we get into a little more of the time travel and philosophy, where the wheels started turning for me, is the grandfather paradox that we kind of learn about with Back to the Future. This is a different type of way of thinking about time. Marker was telling us that time is fixed and that the past cannot be changed, as we also learn in 12 Monkeys. Is he telling us right out by saying the outcome is one of these three things: disappointment, death, or madness?
I think so. The film clearly has a kind of looping format to it, where the beginning tells us the end and the end repeats the beginning. The format of the film, still photographs, also tells us that time is fixed. There's a lot of stasis out there. And I think the fact that he is fated to die suggests that time is indeed fixed, that everything that happens the way it must and cannot be changed. The film endorses what philosophers have called a four-dimensionalist view of time in which past, present, and future are equally real. He travels into the past. He also travels into the future. It also suggests to us that neither the past nor the future can be changed. And so he's impotent to alter his past. He doesn't know it's his past, but we, the viewers, come to find out that, in fact, what he's witnessing is his future. What he's experiencing is what the boy saw in the past, and that those things are fixed in time. As opposed to a film like Back to the Future, where Marty McFly seemingly goes back to the past, interferes with his parents' relationship, and that ends up potentially changing things in the present, such that Marty McFly himself begins to go out of existence.
Is that so? Because of that, is that why you say these are the La Jetée and 12 Monkeys? Is why you say they get the philosophy of time and time travel right?
Yes, most philosophers who write about time and time travel endorse the view that you cannot go into the past and change it. The past is fixed. And in that respect, any time travel film that suggests you can go back and not relive experiences, but change experiences has a mistaken view of time. Marker does not. Marker is already aware that the past is kind of dead. If we fast forward just a few minutes into the film, one of the pivotal scenes in the film is when our protagonist and the woman, and we never do learn their names, which is kind of interesting, when they're spending their last date together in a museum where they're looking at these dead stuffed animals. There's a sense in which they're very clearly indicating that the past is dead, it's stuffed, it's immobile, it can't be changed.
It sounds so grim. The past is dead, but you're right. It just sounds so grim.
I think that might be why Back to the Future is more popular than La Jetée, because Back to the Future holds out the possibility that the past is revisable, that the future is open, and things might be otherwise. La Jetée says, no, the past is dead. It's not revisable, and things couldn't be other than the way that they are.
Well, I'm going to throw a wrench into all of this because
Uh-oh.
when he's injected for the first time, I paused and thought, well, is he really traveling through time? Is this a drug trip that he's using this core memory that he has while he's under some sort of drug? That was one of the first thoughts I had because it just seemed very odd because his body was stationary. And the way that films portray time travel is that your body goes from one point in time to another.
Well, there are a lot of time travel films that are kind of interested in the nature of the equipment that makes time travel possible. And this is a film that isn't interested in how time travel is possible. If you think about something like Christopher Nolan's Interstellar, for instance, Nolan spent a lot of time trying to get the science of time travel right. And it's a great movie, but it's not as an emotionally involving movie as I think La Jetée is, or even 12 Monkeys, which kind of points to the machinery of time travel, but never really discusses the nature of the science of time travel. This is a film which isn't particularly interested in the science of time travel or the machinery of time travel. It's interested more in the experience, the nature of memory, what it means to remember the past. And so I think it leaves open that question of, is he really time traveling? Or is this something going on in his head? And how are we as viewers supposed to make sense of that?
So I was really curious about the German whispering. So I had to look, is there any translation anywhere? One of the prominent whispers heard throughout is half of him is here, the other half is in the past.
Exactly.
That kind of fed into my thought of, well, the half that is his body is stationary. His mind is traveling or his mind is sedated and he's
Yes.
dreaming. So it raised all kind of other questions just in a plot of a movie that's, 60 years old.
Exactly. And the woman herself references his coming and going so mysteriously. And if I remember correctly, she talks about him as her ghost.
Yes.
So he has this kind of transience to him that's kind of mysterious. Now, at the same time, he does travel into the future and he meets these future human beings, and they gift him something that allows France and Paris to recover following this apocalypse. So, presumably, there are other things going on outside of him, or at least we have the sense that there are these other things going on.
So they do meet on the 30th day, finally. He's doing these different travels, we think. I'm still not convinced. And they finally meet on the 30th day, and they're next to each other, and my thought was, what in the hell could they possibly be talking about? Because in his mind, he's seen her before, and this may be the first time she's seeing him on the timeline of how I'm thinking of this, I suppose. But it's the scene of the sequoia tree that I just
Mhm.
absolutely love because Marker clearly was inspired by Vertigo. There's a lot
Yes,
of Vertigo here,
a lot.
and I just love that I wanna say scene. I love those photos of him pointing and saying, "I'm actually from here." I just thought that was such a powerful visual.
Absolutely. And I think there are two things that are kind of interesting there. Another thing that makes this film so interesting is that it is a film about the history of film, given that he's referencing Hitchcock, he's referencing Vertigo. And there was such a love affair with Hitchcock in France throughout the 50s and 60s. So it's a film that is itself kind of intertextual in connecting to Vertigo in very explicit ways, including the scene with the tree. But I think it's also interesting because in both Vertigo and in this film, the woman essentially remains a mystery. We don't know much about what's going on inside her head. She never speaks. We never hear her perspective. We never really find out much about her at all, including what happened to her after he gets shot and killed. So she's something of a cipher, and we only know of her through his eyes.
And I wanna talk about her a little bit more, specifically about the blink. It caught me off guard. I was not ready for it. It was almost how could something this old shock me? Because you're almost lulled to not to sleep, but you're lulled into expectations moving forward. We're well over halfway through, and all of a sudden, you're seeing photos of her, still photos of her in bed, and the photos are coming a little more quickly, and then all
Yes.
of a sudden, we get the only instant of actual motion, and it's her blink. And then a very cruel cut to a man looking down at us, the viewer, presumably the traveler. He's looking at the traveler. What is Marker trying to tell us about this moment? Why did he choose that, in your opinion, to use that as his only piece of motion?
But that's probably like one of those $64,000 questions. I don't know. It provokes the viewer as you experienced yourself.
Absolutely.
So you're watching this film and you're seeing these still images, and as you point out, the cuts are much more rapid leading up to the blink. So we get at least some sense of motion even in these still photos, the way in which he edits them. And then all of a sudden we get this one moment of life, of kind of an eruption of spontaneity or of a dynamic moment in a film which is so much about static. And it's probably a moment of some love or affection that this man feels for her. We're seeing her through his eyes, presumably. So we're experiencing her as he experiences her. And if we pick up on something that you mentioned earlier, the film seems kind of dark. It seems kind of depressing in that there is no change, there is no freedom, everything is faded. Maybe this is one moment that Marker holds out as a moment of hope, of romance, of love, as exceeding the stasis of the camera. It breaks through in that regard.
In the other moments that on my initial watch, that I thought he was trying to give us a little more of those feelings of love and hope is at the museum. We see them laughing. The score,
Yes.
I think, is beautiful. It
Yes.
feels
Which was also
hopeful.
apparently patterned after the score from Vertigo.
Yes. Yes, really neat. I've come to really appreciate this the more that I've read and looked into, and, but on subsequent watches about the museum, I almost I felt tricked because what we're seeing is we're seeing still life, because in a sense, these are still photographs, so there's no difference to the viewer between the traveler, the woman, and the animals in the
Mhm.
museum. There's really no difference. So while the score and the visuals of them laughing makes you feel have a positive response, when you really break it down, I'm not sure that's necessarily the intent.
I think you're right. I think the images are images of dead stuffed animals, and they're fixed in their cages. And in several of the photographs, the woman and the man seem to be occupying very similar kinds of they seem to be standing in ways similar to the ways that the animals are standing,
Mm.
almost as if they themselves are museum pieces. And we know subsequently there's going to be some kind of nuclear annihilation. So in some respects, they are museum pieces. And they're preserved in ember, so to speak, or amber, in the context of those photographs. So there's perhaps very little to distinguish the dead stuffed animals that are on display and these two human beings.
So this is the last time that they are together until he appears again at the pier. And I found myself wondering if there's something ethically wrong with this idea of this person that continues to appear and disappear in this woman's life. I think the director is showing us that he is in love with her. She's referring to him as her ghost. And I found myself again wondering, is there something ethically about someone that just shows up and disappears in your life and you never know when, where, how, and we never get her perspective, as you say.
That's right. That's right. And I think cinematically, it's kind of interesting. And this is one of the things that kind of emerged for me out of the series of time travel films that we were talking about. So if you think of La Jetée, 12 Monkeys, Back to the Future, and Looper, these are all films that focus primarily on masculine characters, men, who are the time travelers. And in each case, there's a woman who's kind of the passive viewer who performs a passive role, often a caring role, in the context of the time traveler. The woman doesn't time travel. The woman doesn't affect any changes to the course of time. The woman doesn't really do anything other than be there for the man, whether it's Marty McFly's mother who falls for him, or in the case of Looper, I can't remember the character's name, the Emily Watson character?
Emily
Uh,
Blunt, I think.
Emily Blunt, yes, who ends up caring for Joe as he travels. In the context of 12 Monkeys, it's Madeline who cares for James Cole. So it's the men who do the traveling. It's the men who are agents. It's the men who are active. And the women are largely there in passive caring roles. And so, in some respects, I think it's not only the ethics of this man coming in and out of her life, but also the ethics of the filmmaker and what the filmmaker is choosing to portray in fairly stereotypical gender roles as we think about men, women, and the nature of time travel. And of course, there's been a lot of other time travel films in which that's the case. Terminator, for instance, even if you go back to the H.G. Wells Time Machine film, it's almost always the case that the active agent who's time traveling is the man.
I think that's part of the beauty of PDF too, because people that came to all four, or at least the three that I was in attendance for, were very quick to point out exactly what you're talking about.
Yeah.
And it was always a woman that pointed it out because I'm not thinking in that space, but I was very happy that somebody did because it made me like you're naming some of these other films. It made me look at things a little more critically.
Absolutely. And sometimes there are things that don't occur to me until after the fact or until someone mentions them. I put together the current series in which we're looking at morality in cinema and three great films, but it didn't occur to me until after I put them together that they almost all focus on men. They are directed by men. They are the story of men, and women play a subsidiary role. And this has been a problem with cinema in general. So I think, again, if you go back to your fundamental question, why this film, in some respects, it's an interesting film that both contests many of the characteristics of film, but in other respects falls into some of the same traps that cinema has almost universally always fallen into. And I think that's especially the case when it comes to thinking about gender.
So they're together in the museum, seemingly happy, and he's yanked away. He's going back to the present time, and now we get a brief encounter with the people of the future with very strange things that they have between their eyes. I haven't been able to narrow down exactly
They're
what those are.
post-human.
Yes. Oh, that's right up your alley.
Yes.
Why even give us a glimpse of the future? Like, is it even a needed part of the story? Maybe it's setting up his choice, but this glimpse of the future, I guess I answered my own question, because he does eventually choose to return rather
Yes.
than accept the refuge of the future. So he goes and they provide an energy solution to restore energy, and they allow the quote unquote present time, because like, what is present time? That's another philosophical
Exactly.
question. this
It's subjective.
it's yes. So they offer him this energy solution to get humanity back on track. They decide they would like to accept him as one of their own, and he rejects. Instead, he asks to go to a time of his childhood, is what the narration says, which I find very interesting. The choice that the character makes, he could go to any time and chooses the time of his childhood, that because that was his core memory.
That's right.
Why do they kill him?
Well, I think there's a couple of things. So one has to remember that all these experiments with time travel are carried out with the goal of traveling to the future. That was their motivation from the beginning. They weren't interested, the people experimenting on this guy weren't interested in time travel per se. They were interested in going to the future to see if there was some way to save humanity. That was their objective. And that's why they finally pull him back from the museum and send him to the future. That was their objective all along. Once he secures for them what they want, and as you point out, he's given the offer by the people in the future who seem to be very powerful. He chooses to go back into the past. It's not clear, I think, in the movie itself, why they find it necessary to kill him. I'm not sure, other than the fact that one could say, well, he's expendable. They killed a lot of people in the context of the experiments they were pursuing. We hear in the narration that other people have died. He's a prisoner. There's a sense in which they need to enforce their domination over him and not let him go. Maybe they don't fully themselves understand the implications of time travel. Maybe they suspect that if he were free to roam in the past, he could somehow change things, even though the film itself suggests that that's not the case. But they may not understand the nature of time travel itself. And that's probably a decent hypothesis.
I guess they had to make good on the narrative earlier in the film where they said these are the only three ways that this ends. They say at the end, he knew there was no way out of time. And that's just, again, hitting on that theme of this is fixed. The past is fixed, although the past is also his future at the same time. So that's another brain buster. This is why sitting and listening to people talk is like, I'm not even going to raise my hand off for anything at this point because I'm still trying to figure out who's where and when. So if La Jetée is made almost entirely of stills, is it still a film? Did someone bring that up when you did the screening?
I'm sure someone did, because someone always does.
Oh, I
And
guess, yes,
and
you taught this for many years. I'm sure you've heard the question before. Is this even a film?
exactly. And of course that raises what so let me back up for a second. Philosophy is often portrayed as being all about concepts and the clarification of concepts. We think about the nature of evil. the nature of truth, the nature of the mind or the soul. And we try to clarify how we use these concepts. In the context of philosophy and film, one of the questions is, well, what is film? What makes film film? So to ask the question, is this even a film, kind of presupposes that we know what makes a film film.
You answer that like a philosopher. You know that.
Well, it's an occupational hazard, unfortunately. And it allows me always to turn back the questions that people pose to me. Is this even a film? And then I could say, well, let's think about that question. What is a film? And I think probably in the history of cinema, there have always been people who have kind of pushed the limits of what we think of as film and have engaged in what we might think of as cinematic experiments. Andy Warhol, for instance, and this I'm doing from recollection, so I may not get this exactly right. Andy Warhol made a film of the Empire State Building, in which he pointed a camera at the Empire State Building and filmed it for, I think, several hours. Now, when you sit in a theater and you watch a film unfold in which it's a single image of a building, is that a film? What does it mean for a film not to involve narrative or character or movement, as in La Jetée, which is a film which is static? It raises questions about just what the nature of film is. And how do we distinguish between film and photographs, or film and television, or film and Instagram reels? What are the distinctions there that drive labeling one film and the other not? If you go back to your fundamental question, why this film? I think one answer to that question is because it's a film that raises questions about the nature of film.
It puts you in the position that your mind is its own projector.
Yes.
Is that the voiceover and the stills, it's forcing you to use your own imagination. You're filling in the gaps based on
That's
all
right.
of your previous experiences of movie going or watching films or anything in cinema. Is that you're kind of animating the motion yourself. And I'm glad that I had the opportunity, and I'm actually happy that you pushed this back a few days because it gave me the opportunity to sit and watch a few more times. And I feel like it gets a little bit better every time, but then I also have more and more questions.
Uh-huh. Well, I think that's a mark of a good film in that regard.
So I'm going to give you the last word here. Sum up as best you can. Why La Jetée? Why does it deserve its place in the Criterion Collection?
There are a lot of reasons why, but let me pick up on just the last one that I mentioned as one of the most important ones, because it is a film which raises the question about the conditions of possibility of film. It's a film which kind of interrogates the nature of the film experience and what it means to be a movie. And in that regard, it's doing something that's kind of fundamental to the very nature of film. So I think the first reason is it's a film which interrogates the nature of film. It's a film also whose form mirrors its content. It's a film about time and memory and time travel, and it's constructed in a way which equally addresses time and memory and time travel. So I think it's a relatively rare film in which its form and its content mirror each other in very interesting and intriguing ways. It's also a deeply philosophical film, both because it raises questions about what is film, but it raises questions about what is time, what is memory, what is the nature of the past. And in raising those deeply philosophical films, it's a film worthy of some reflection. It's a film which also speaks to other films and cinematic history and what it means to be a film in a history of other films. So the way that it references Vertigo very explicitly asks us to think about this film in relation to the films that have come prior to it. And even its format as still images do something very similar. Probably as a kid, you did something, I guess kids still do this. You make those little flip books where you do a little image and you change it very slowly on multiple pages, and then you flip it, and all of a sudden it's moving. And in that respect, this film harkens back to the very earliest experiences of film, experiences which didn't have anything to do with cameras at all, but say to animation in the way that kids perform animation with flip books. So finally, I would say it's worthy of being in the Criterion Collection because of how influential it's been and just how it has influenced and continues to influence both thinking about what film is possible or what's possible with film, but also how to think about time and time travel in the context of cinema.
Well, thank you so much, because without you, I would not have dug into this further, because this was a selection that you made. And I wasn't, as I said before, I sat to watch it the first time and I'm thinking, what in the world is going on here? And now I feel like I have a brand new appreciation. It deserves its place. You didn't have to convince me, but thank you
Good.
so much. And I appreciate your insight. Thanks for listening to this episode of Why This Film. I'd like to thank Dr. Dennis Weiss for joining me and for sharing his insights on La Jetée. I'll be sitting down with guests to explore more films from the Criterion Collection, and together we'll attempt to answer why they were included and why they still matter. Be sure to follow, subscribe, and keep an eye out for the next episode.